The rain came down in sheets, cold as a slap and loud enough to drown thought. Caleb Sterling hunched his shoulders, the collar of his soaked duster clinging to his neck as he guided his horse along the muddy trail just past Miller's Creek. The old wooden bridge, a relic of some long-forgotten cattle route, lay barely a quarter-mile ahead. The sky had gone from moody gray to full-blown fury in under 15 minutes. He hadn't expected a storm not this late in the season, not this far south. But here it was turning a mild summer evening into a tempest worthy of scripture. He was no stranger to bad weather. Storms in these parts came with the territory just like rattlesnakes and land disputes. But this storm had teeth. The kind of cold that cut through layers and settled into your bones when sharp enough to slice a man's cheek open if he wasn't careful. And then came the sound. It wasn't the thunder, though, that was loud enough to make his mare shy sideways. It wasn't the roar of the creek, which had swelled into a wide frothing torrent at least 30 feet across, easily 5 times its usual width. It was something else. A cry high human and panicked. A sound that didn't belong to the wind or the rain, or even the wild animals that sometimes got too close to town. This was desperation in its rawest form. Without thinking, Caleb leapt from the saddle boots, sinking 6 inches into the churned mud as he ran toward the noise. It was coming from the water. He saw her almost immediately, flailing in the current, a blur of long black hair and soaked fabric. She was maybe 80 feet upstream, caught in a whirl of debris and foam. Her arms thrashed wildly, fighting not just the river, but the fear of being forgotten by the world. He didn't think. He didn't weigh the odds or consider the risks. There was no calculation, only instinct. Caleb tossed his coat aside and dove in. The water hit him like a wall, icy, brutal, and fast. His boots dragged him down, and for a second he wondered if he just made the dumbest decision of his life. But then he kicked upward, broke the surface, and aimed himself toward her. Each stroke felt like pushing through wet cement. The current pulled at him like it had a personal grudge. 10 feet, then 20. The girl's head went under. No, damn it, not like this. He reached her just as she resurfaced, her mouth wide in a silent scream. Her eyes locked with his, dark-wide, terrified. He extended a hand. She took it with surprising force, fingers like iron despite her exhaustion. It took everything Caleb had to haul them both back toward shore. Every yard was a war. His lungs screamed, his muscles burned. At one point, he wasn't sure if he was dragging her or she was dragging him. When they finally collapsed onto the muddy bank, both of them were shaking, gasping more water than air in their lungs. She lay beside him, coughing hard, her dress soaked and torn. Caleb's heart thundered in his chest louder than any gunfight he had ever been in. His hands trembled, whether from the cold or adrenaline, he couldn't tell. The girl looked barely 19. Her skin glistened with river water, her long black hair plastered to her cheeks. But her eyes weren't that of a frightened girl. They were ancient, knowing. "You saved my life," she said. Her voice was careful, deliberate, not grateful, aware, like she already knew what saving her would cost him. "Anyone would have done the same," Caleb muttered, wringing out his shirt with shaking hands. "No," she said, standing slowly, despite her ordeal. "Not anyone." Then she looked him straight in the eye and said something that chilled him far more than the river ever could. "Caleb Sterling, tomorrow you will understand." He froze, not just at the sound of her voice, but at the way she said his name. He had never seen her before, yet she spoke as though she'd known him all her life. She turned and walked toward the tree line, barefoot, wet, and impossibly calm. By the time she vanished into the woods, the storm had already started to fade, leaving behind only the sound of the rushing creek and the pounding of Caleb's heart. But in that moment, he knew something deep in his gut. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something he could not yet name. And he was right. Caleb Sterling can't sleep. Even though his body was still aching from the struggle with the water, even though the sky was clear and the night breeze was cool, his mind was still reeling with the image of the girl named Ayanna. Her eyes, her last words, and especially the inexplicable way she knew his name. As the sun was rising the next day, he went out to check on the stables and heard something strange. A deep, steady sound in the distance, the sound of horses' hooves. Not one or two, dozens. Then he saw dust rising from all directions, as if the prairie were moving. Caleb narrowed his eyes. 5 groups of riders were approaching his ranch, each coming from a different direction, like the arms of a giant hand closing around him. They weren't shouting, they weren't wielding weapons. They were carrying other things, bundles of silk wooden boxes inlaid with mother-of-pearl ornate carvings he'd seen only in ancient native ceremonies. He stood still, his hand instinctively on the butt of his gun. But there was no threat in their eyes, only seriousness, and something close to reverence. A silver-haired old man with long braids dismounted first. He walked slowly toward Caleb, his eyes never leaving him. Behind him were 4 more chieftains from 5 different tribes. Each one came forward bearing an object, a silver bow inlaid with gems, a ceremonial dagger with a bone handle carved into the shape of a spirit animal, a sacred eagle feather in a ring, a red-painted ancestral mask, and finally a cloak woven from the fibers of a sacred plant, something only the chosen one could wear. "You were the one who pulled Ayana from the water," the silver-haired old man said, his voice as deep and steady as rock. "Yes," Caleb replied, swallowing. "But I don't understand why it's so important." The old man nodded, but his eyes carried a deep sadness. "Because you have awakened what has been dormant for 3 generations, what our ancestors called the Bridge Covenant." One of the younger clan leaders stepped forward. In his hand, he held a beautiful bow wrapped in red cloth. "This bow belonged to my ancestor, the one who made the first peace treaty between our clans. It has never been given to an outsider. Until today." Caleb felt his face heat up. "I just saved a girl from drowning. I didn't do anything to deserve this. But that is what makes you worthy," the man continued. "The chosen one is the one who acts not because of promises, not because of benefits. He acts simply because it is the right thing to do." Caleb felt his feet rooted to the ground. He was at the center of a story larger than himself. A legend, a prophecy. Then the old man with white hair spoke slowly, as if reciting ancient lines that had been passed down by word of mouth for centuries. "The chosen one will not come as a conqueror, but with a heart that knows no fear. He will pull the bridge across the abyss, not for glory, but for mercy. And from that act, the fate of the entire land will turn." Caleb shook his head, his voice trembling. I don't know who she is. I don't know what I'm doing. That's why you're the only one who can do it," said another elder. Then the silver-haired old man's voice dropped almost to a sigh. "But you need to know one more thing. Ayana is not just a girl of the 5 tribes, and she is the last heir to a blood pact, signed in blood and kept secret by those who died to protect it." Caleb raised his head, a chill running down his spine. "That blood pact is the only key to the sacred valley, where our ancestors hid the thing that could end all wars, or start the last war." The old man's words echoed in Caleb's head like an ancient drum. This was no longer a ceremony. This was no longer a tradition. This was a responsibility. And though no one spoke, he knew. From the moment he pulled the girl to shore, his life no longer belonged to him alone. Caleb sat motionless on the wooden steps, his hands clasping a cup of coffee that had long since cooled. Before him was a sun-scorched prairie stretching to the horizon, but his mind was stuck on the words from yesterday's ceremony, prophecies, blood pacts, and a destiny tied to a girl he'd met less than a day earlier. And then she appeared again, as if by appointment. Ayana stepped out from the trees at the edge of the forest, not wet this time, not shivering, not panicking. She walked barefoot, her steps light as the wind, but her eyes were as heavy as a 1,000-year-old stone. She said nothing at first. She just sat down next to Caleb, placing between them a black stone that shone strangely blue in the sunlight. "Who do you think I am, Caleb Sterling?" she asked, her voice cutting through the air. Caleb looked at the stone, then back at her. He shook his head, exhaling. "I thought you were the girl I risked my life to save. But now I'm not so sure. You know my name. You know I'll be there. And now you carry the fate of 5 tribes. You're not an ordinary girl." Ayana nodded, her eyes never leaving the stone. "Yes, I am not normal, and I do not need to be saved." The words cut like a knife. Caleb felt himself being pushed back from his own memories. "You jumped into the river because you knew I would save you," he asked, anger mixed with hurt rising like a tide. "Right." The truth was like a slap, bitter, painful, and most of all, betrayal. "So what am I?" "A pawn." Ayana did not flinch. "You are the only choice. Unbound by tribe, untainted by vendettas. A stranger who can act out of compassion, not power or tradition." Caleb jumped to his feet and stepped off the porch steps, his heart pounding like a drum. "I don't want to get involved in your political games. "It's not a game," she said behind him. "It's war, and I'm trying to stop it." He turned back, his eyes losing their trust. "By staging a drowning, by manipulating people with shady prophecies, you think you're preventing war, but all you're doing is setting up a chess game, and I'm just a pawn." Ayana stood up and walked toward him, her voice trembling for the first time. "I lost my mother to that blood pact, killed trying to hide the location of the sacred valley from those who wanted to use it to wage a holy war. I have no family left. I had no choice but to set up a situation where you had to choose." What Caleb asked, his voice hoarse. "Betray my people or lead this place into tribal war?" She moved closer, her eyes sparkling with long-suppressed despair. "No. Choose between being human or being an instrument of fear. You don't have to stand on anyone's side. You just have to stand on the side of what's right." He didn't answer. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together in his mind, her eyes as he pulled her ashore. The gifts from the tribes, the words of the elders, the feeling of being drawn into something both sacred and conspiratorial. This wasn't about a girl anymore. It was about the line between compassion and exploitation, truth and manipulation. He wanted to believe her. His heart still remembered the fear in her eyes as she nearly drowned. But now everything was tinged with doubt. Caleb took a step back. "I need time," Ayana just nodded. "You have until sunset. After that, someone else will make the decision for you." She turned away, leaving the stone on the porch step. It continued to glow strangely, like a smoldering fire waiting for someone to decide whether to use it to warm or burn everything down. Caleb watched her figure disappear into the woods. He had never felt so lost in the land he had lived all his life. Caleb Sterling never believed in fate. He believed in guns and hoofprints on dry ground and the silence between breaths before the trigger was pulled. He believed in the earth that he could plow, sow, harvest. But fate, prophecy, being chosen to him, those were just campfire tales to keep children from being afraid of the dark. Until the stone began to glow in his hand. It was not a light made by men. It did not flash like fire, nor burn like the sun. It breathed. It was as if it had a soul within it. When his fingers touched the icy surface, a sensation ran down his spine, not cold, but opening. It was as if someone, or something, from long ago saw through him, through every layer of flesh, every memory, every belief he thought was immutable. And then, it said, not in words, in images, in feelings. In that moment, Caleb was no longer standing on his porch. He was in a circle of fire, not burning, but illuminating. Surrounding him were ancient tribes, old and young men and women, all looking at him as if he were the last milepost before the abyss. He saw bloodshed from generation to generation. He saw children growing up with eyes as dry as the desert. He saw himself growing old alone in a cold, divided world. But he saw other things too. Children playing without distinction of race. Native and white men building homes together, sharing meals, keeping ancestral fires alive as a new family. But what took his breath away was the truth of the stone. The ancestors of the tribes did not create weapons to end war. They created a test. The stone does not carry power. It measures strength, not by muscle, but by forgiveness. Not by honor, but by the ability to let go of hatred. It doesn't choose the strongest. It chooses the one most willing to sacrifice. And Caleb Sterling, the lonely cowboy who lived only to survive, was chosen because he saved a stranger for no reason. As the light from the stone faded, Caleb opened his eyes. Cold sweat ran down his back, though the air was cool. There was an echo in his heart that had no language, but he understood it as if it were born of his own blood. Solidarity is not a given. It is a choice we make when no one else has the courage to make it. The sound of hooves came from the north. He saw dust rising, a cavalry was approaching. An army. From the west, the smoke of the tribe's campfires had come first. Ayana was there. Those who trusted him were waiting. From the south, warriors with weapons, faces painted with war, hearts stained with blood. From the east, the sun rose high, casting a golden light on the ground divided by human shadows. Caleb stood up. He was no longer a farmer, no longer the one who saved the girl. You are the one who holds the choice. And in that moment, Caleb understood there was no one else. There was no miracle. There was no afterward. Only now and you. He gripped the stone tightly. The wind swirled around him like a faint song from an ancient dream. Everything would explode, in blood or in hope, and everyone was looking at him to know, would this day end in unity or in a mass grave? Caleb walked towards Ayanna, and fate followed him. The light from the last stone was extinguished, but what it left behind could not be extinguished. It was in the eyes of those who had once pointed guns at each other, now looking at each other as if for the first time seeing a human being behind the mask of war. It was also echoed in the silence after the storm, a silence that carried not fear but astonishment at the realization no one had just died. No one had just lost a family. There was no blood on the ground. No one loses. The stone shattered under Colonel Hayes's bullet, but before it disintegrated, it released one last wave of energy, an energy that had no form, no fire, but truth. Fragments of memories, visions, futures, all flooded into each person's mind in a brief moment, but changed them forever. Morrison, who had always followed orders like a compass, was the first to put away his gun. Kororook, who had sworn never to let a white man touch the relic, was the first to step forward, shielding Caleb. The soldiers, many of whom were not yet old enough to understand what war was, looked at each other, then, one by one, they put down their guns. And Ayanna, who had carried the burden of the blood pact, who had used lies to fuel the prophecy, shed tears at that moment no longer out of fear or calculation, but because finally someone had made the right choice. There were no cheers, no trumpets of victory, just the afternoon sun shining through the silent dust and once trembling hands now clasped together. 3 months later, in what had once been a nameless field next to Caleb's farm, a settlement sprang up, not according to military maps or tribal boundaries, but according to the flow of faith. Children ran around the square, where in the center was a stone monument built from the fragments of the sacred stone, no longer glowing but still attracting the eye like a whispering flame. 2 languages are taught side by side in a small school at the end of a red dirt road. A group of native blacksmiths and Eastern immigrants set up shop carving ancestral mascots, and the story of a day that should have been bloody, but wasn't. People called Caleb many names. Bridge Walker, the one who chose, the one who didn't belong but was accepted. But to Caleb, he was still just the man who believed in nothing but guns and silence. Until a girl fell into the river. Ayanna was now part of that community, strong, calm, and happy. She married one of the young clan leaders. They had their first child the first spring after the event. Every year on the day the stone breaks, people gather around the monument, not to reminisce about the past, but to make a commitment to the future. That they will never let fear guide them, that they will choose dialogue over guns. And if one day someone else is faced with the same choice Caleb once faced, they will have a legacy of faith to fall back on. "Do you regret it?" Ayanna asked Caleb one summer afternoon as they watched children playing around the monument. Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "No, I only regret that it was only when I was on the brink of death that I realized no one really wins if someone else loses." Ayanna smiled, her eyes following her son, playing with a white girl with blonde hair. But there are people who are willing to make the right choice, so that these children never have to know what winning is. And so from the shattered stone, something else was born, the ability to be reborn from brokenness, faith in doubt, and reconciliation in the hearts of people who once hated each other. No supernatural light needed, no miracles needed. It only takes one person for one moment to dare to choose the right thing.